Today, a structured overview of FDA REMS programs in psychiatry, which drugs require them, what they demand in practice, and the major 2025 change to one of the most widely prescribed psychiatric medications. A REMS, risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, is the FDA's most powerful risk management tool. The legal authority comes from FDAA, the FDA Amendments Act of 2007. Before FDAA, the FDA could require labeling changes but could not compel manufacturers to build formal safety systems. That changed. A REMS is not optional. Once the FDA determines a drug's risk profile requires more than standard labeling, the manufacturer must implement it, or the drug does not get approved. There are two tiers. The first is a REMS with ETASU, elements to assure safe use. These are programmatic requirements: prescriber certification, healthcare setting certification, patient enrollment, mandatory monitoring, or an implementation system that gates each prescription. ETASU is where real clinical workflow lives. The second tier is a communication plan only. These use educational materials to communicate risk, but impose no certification, enrollment, or monitoring requirements. Understanding which tier applies to a drug matters enormously. ETASU-based REMS reshape clinical operations. A communication plan does not. ETASU has 5 element categories. Different drugs require different combinations. First, prescriber certification, training, and formal enrollment before writing a prescription. Both Spravato and Zyprexa require this. Second, healthcare setting certification. The facility must be certified and meet infrastructure requirements like emergency equipment and continuous monitoring capability. Third, patient enrollment. The patient must be enrolled before receiving the drug. Fourth, monitoring or testing requirements, lab values, or observation periods before each dose. Spravato's 2-hour post-dose monitoring and Zyprexa 3-hour post-injection observation both fall here. Fifth, an implementation system, a technical gatekeeping mechanism that must authorize each dispense before the pharmacist can release the drug. Spravato uses this. The key point: ETASU elements are not bureaucratic obstacles. Each one addresses a specific documented failure mode. When you prescribe within a REMS program, you're working inside a safety architecture built around real harm events. These 3 frameworks are commonly confused. They operate independently and are enforced by different agencies. Standard labeling, the prescribing information, is the baseline. Every drug has it. It is the floor, not the ceiling, of drug safety communication. A REMS adds a layer the FDA can mandate when serious risks cannot be adequately addressed through labeling alone. Not all drugs have REMS. DEA scheduling operates on a separate axis. The DEA classifies drugs into schedules I through V based on abuse potential under the Controlled Substances Act. The key patterns: a drug can be Schedule II with no REMS. Adderall and Vyvanse are Schedule II with no REMS. A drug can have a REMS with no DEA schedule. Zyprexa has a REMS, but is not a controlled substance. Spravato is both Schedule III and has an ETASU-based REMS. You must satisfy both frameworks independently. Here are the psychiatric drugs with active REMS programs in 2026. For treatment-resistant depression, Spravato, esketamine, has an ETASU-based REMS. REMS goal: sedation, dissociation, respiratory depression, and abuse potential. 2-hour minimum observation with pulse oximetry at every session, plus a REMS authorization check before each dose. For schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, Zyprexa olanzapine pamoate injectable, has an ETASU-based REMS for post-injection delirium and sedation syndrome. 3-hour observation after every injection at a certified healthcare setting. For opioid use disorder, 3 REMS programs. The BTOD shared system covers Suboxone and generic buprenorphine/naloxone. Sublocade monthly depot injection has its own ETASU REMS focused on preventing IV self-administration. Brixadi, weekly injection, has a similar structure. For acute agitation, ETASU inhaled loxapine has an ETASU REMS for bronchospasm risk. requiring spirometry around the first dose. The FDA currently lists 74 REMS programs total. 62 are ETASU-based. Absence of a REMS does not mean a drug is safe. It means the FDA determined the risks could be managed through other mechanisms. Vivitrol, extended-release naltrexone, has no REMS. Despite requiring a 7-10-day opioid-free period before first injection and liver function monitoring, risk management relies on labeling and clinical guidelines rather than a formal REMS. Stimulants are the clearest example. Adderall, Vyvanse, and other Schedule II stimulants have no REMS. The DEA scheduling system, which restricts prescribing, refills, and record-keeping, was deemed sufficient to address abuse risk without a separate REMS. Gabapentin, despite Schedule V status and documented abuse potential in some states, has no REMS. The pattern, FDA adds REMS only when labeling or DEA scheduling cannot adequately mitigate the specific risk. This is a risk management proportionality decision, not a safety hierarchy. Clozapine's REMS elimination is the most significant recent change in psychiatric drug risk management. For decades, clozapine carried one of the most intensive monitoring programs in psychopharmacology. The agranulocytosis risk required weekly ANC monitoring for 6 months, bi-weekly for months 7 through 12, monthly thereafter. The clozapine REMS required enrollment, pharmacy certification, and ANC reporting to a central registry. In November 2024, joint FDA advisory committees voted to recommend discontinuation. The rationale: prescriber knowledge had improved, 20 years of data showed monitoring was embedded in practice, and the REMS was creating access barriers for a drug used by only about 148,000 of an estimated 814,000 to 1.2 million people with treatment-resistant schizophrenia. On February 24, 2025, the FDA eliminated the clozapine REMS. Critical distinction: ANC monitoring is still recommended per the prescribing information. The schedule, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, is unchanged. What was removed was the programmatic gatekeeping. Pharmacists can now dispense without REMS verification. The clinical obligation to monitor has not changed. Most important practical point: for some drugs, REMS is an administrative checkbox. For others, it is the entire clinical workflow. Spravato is the clearest example. Prescribing Spravato means enrolling the patient in a 2-hour in-clinic monitoring session at every dosing visit. Pulse oximetry, blood pressure monitoring, companion required for transportation home, no driving until the next day. This is not paperwork, it is the treatment. Zyprexa requires a 3-hour post-injection observation after every single injection, not just the first. Post-injection delirium and sedation syndrome can occur after any injection. If you are adding a REMS-mandated drug to your practice, you are not adding a prescription. You are adding a clinical workflow with staffing, space, equipment, and monitoring requirements. The enrollment steps are the beginning, not the end. Coming up in this series, a Spravato deep dive covering the precise monitoring workflow and evidence for efficacy. Zyprexa with focus on post-injection delirium and emergency protocols. Buprenorphine products, Sublocade depot versus Suboxone, compared side by side. And the 2026 REMS landscape, including clozapine's new post-REMS era and what it tells us about how the FDA releases these programs. Questions about today's content or topics you'd like to see covered in future episodes? Drop them in the comments below. And if you found this clinically useful, hit subscribe. More psychopharmacology breakdowns are coming. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for clinical judgment.